The Shadow on Ridgeway Road. Officer Daniel Harper had seen a lot during his 10 years on the force, but nothing could have prepared him for the call that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It was a late autumn night when the call came in. A frantic voice on the other end of the line claimed they saw a child standing in the middle of Ridgeway Road, just outside of town. Ridgeway was a notorious stretch of road, cutting through dense woods and known for being a hotspot for accidents. The dispatcher told Harper it wasn't the first time someone had called about a child on the road. Harper responded immediately. It was about a 15-minute drive from where he was stationed, and the entire way there, he felt an unsettling pressure in his chest. It wasn't uncommon to get strange calls during night shifts, but this one felt different. He arrived at the location, dark, silent woods on either side of the empty road. His headlights cut through the mist that had begun to settle over the asphalt. He slowed down, scanning both sides of the road, but saw nothing. He was just about to radio in when his car's engine sputtered. The lights flickered for a moment before everything shut off, leaving him in total darkness. Suddenly, a voice crackled over the radio, a child's voice, soft and eerily calm. "Help me, please." Harper froze. The voice hadn't come through dispatch. It was directly over his car's radio system. He grabbed the flashlight from his passenger seat and stepped out of the vehicle, his breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. The forest was unnervingly quiet, and the mist seemed to thicken, obscuring his surroundings. "Hello?" Harper called out into the void. No response, only the sound of his own breathing. He walked around the car, shining his light into the woods. His heart pounded as he saw a small figure standing just beyond the tree line, a child no older than 7, wearing old-fashioned clothing. The boy stood perfectly still, his pale face partially obscured by shadows. "Hey, are you okay?" Harper asked, stepping forward cautiously. The boy didn't move. As Harper approached, he noticed something strange: the child's eyes. They were vacant, as though he wasn't truly seeing anything in front of him. Harper's flashlight flickered, and a wave of unease washed over him. Suddenly, the boy spoke again in the same soft, chilling voice. "Help me. I'm cold." Before Harper could respond, the child turned and ran deeper into the woods. Harper hesitated for a moment, then followed, pushing through the dense underbrush. He called out for the boy, but the child never turned around, always just out of reach. Harper's lungs burned as he chased the boy, stumbling over roots and branches. After what felt like hours, he came upon a clearing. His breath caught in his throat. There, in the middle of the clearing, was an old, rusted car, decades old, its windows shattered and body consumed by rust and vines. Inside the car, Harper saw something that made his stomach turn. There, slumped over in the driver's seat, was a skeleton, still partially clothed in tattered fabric. The passenger seat held a smaller skeleton, clearly that of a child. Harper stepped closer, his hands trembling as he noticed something horrifying: the same old-fashioned clothes the boy he had seen was wearing. The realization hit him like a freight train. The child wasn't alive. As he stood there, frozen, a cold wind rushed through the clearing, and once again, the child's voice whispered, "Help me." Harper didn't wait to hear more. He sprinted back toward the road, his heart pounding in his chest. When he finally reached his patrol car, the engine started without issue. He radioed for backup, but when they arrived, they found no sign of the boy or the wrecked car in the woods. The next day, Harper learned from an old-timer in town that decades ago, a woman and her son had died in a car accident on that very road. Their car had veered off into the woods late one night, and no one had found them for months. The boy, it was said, had wandered out of the car in search of help, but never made it back. From that night on, Ridgeway Road was never the same for Officer Harper. He avoided that stretch of highway whenever possible, but he would occasionally hear dispatch calls about a child in the road, and he knew it was the same boy, still searching for help he would never receive. The disappearing callers. Officer Carla Mendoza was working a particularly quiet night shift in the sleepy town of Hollow Creek when she received a call that would shake her belief in reality. 911, what's your emergency? She answered, her voice steady despite the boredom of the uneventful night. Help me, please. A woman's voice whispered over the line. The voice was trembling, panicked. They're inside my house. I'm hiding, but I don't know how long I have. Mendoza's heart skipped a beat as she immediately typed in the address the woman provided and dispatched officers to the location, a small house on the edge of town. She reassured the woman, keeping her on the line, asking questions about the intruders. I don't know who they are, the woman said, her voice barely audible. They're not human. They're shadows. A chill ran down Mendoza's spine at the bizarre statement, but she continued to ask questions, hoping to keep the woman calm until help arrived. However, the more the woman described, the stranger the situation seemed. She insisted that the shadows were whispering to her, moving through the walls, creeping closer. When the responding officers arrived at the house, Mendoza listened as they radioed in their approach. We're outside, Officer Roberts reported. House looks abandoned. There's no lights on. Mendoza frowned. The caller said she's inside, hiding. You need to check. After a few tense minutes of searching, Roberts came back over the radio. No one's here. Place has been empty for years. Looks like no one's lived here in at least a decade. Mendoza felt a knot of confusion tighten in her stomach. But I'm still on the phone with her. She looked at her monitor and saw that the call had been disconnected. The following day, Mendoza couldn't shake the strange occurrence. She looked up the history of the address and discovered something shocking. A decade earlier, a woman had lived in that house. She had called 911 reporting that intruders had broken into her home. By the time police arrived, she had been murdered. Her case had never been solved, and no one had lived in the house since. Shaken to her core, Mendoza reviewed the 911 call records and found a chilling pattern. Over the years, multiple calls had come from that same house, always from a terrified woman claiming there were intruders inside. But each time, the house had been empty upon police arrival. The dead woman's voice was still crying for help, locked in a loop of terror that stretched beyond the grave. The Shadow on Ridgeway Road. In the days following his disturbing encounter on Ridgeway Road, Officer Harper found it hard to sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's pale face, his blank eyes staring through him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the boy had wanted something from him, something Harper hadn't been able to give. Worse, the small town's eerie silence about the accident haunted him even more. No one wanted to talk about the woman and her son who had died in that crash, as if mentioning them would summon their spirits back. One night, a week after the incident, Harper was sitting in his patrol car at the edge of town, trying to distract himself with paperwork, when his radio crackled to life. Ridgeway Road, send backup, a voice whispered, just like before. Harper's heart raced as he grabbed the radio. Who is this? Dispatch, do you copy? Nothing. He sat there in the suffocating silence, gripping the steering wheel. Against his better judgment, he drove back to Ridgeway Road. As his headlights pierced through the darkness, he swore he saw movement up ahead. A faint silhouette, a boy, stood in the middle of the road. Harper slammed on his brakes, coming to a skidding halt. The boy stood perfectly still, staring at him with those same empty eyes. Then, without warning, the boy turned and disappeared into the woods again. Harper cursed under his breath, but knew he couldn't leave. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped out of the car, the cold air immediately wrapping around him. The wind whispered through the trees, and he heard it again. "Help me." This time the voice wasn't distant. It was right behind him. Harper spun around, flashlight swinging wildly through the mist. And then he saw it. A figure standing just inside the tree line. Not the boy this time, but a woman. She looked as though she had stepped out of time, her long dress tattered, hair matted and wild. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed toward the woods, her mouth opening as if to scream, but no sound came out. And then she vanished, dissolving into the mist. Harper stumbled backward, nearly falling as he rushed back to his car. His pulse thundered in his ears as he sped back to town. He reported the incident, but his superiors dismissed it as exhaustion or stress. That night, Harper couldn't sleep. He knew something was wrong with Ridgeway Road, something that had to do with the boy and his mother. He dove into the town's archives, searching for any clues. What he found chilled him to the core. The woman had indeed died in a car accident, but what the reports didn't mention was that her son's body hadn't been found for weeks. He had wandered into the woods, searching for help, but died of exposure before anyone could locate him. His body had been found in the same clearing where Harper had seen the old wreck. The boy and his mother were trapped in the liminal space between life and death, their restless spirits bound to the road where they had perished. And it seemed they wouldn't rest until someone helped them. But how could he help the dead? The next night, Harper returned to Ridgeway Road one last time. He parked his car at the edge of the woods and walked toward the clearing, determined to put their souls to rest. As he entered the clearing, he saw them, both the boy and the woman, standing by the wrecked car. The boy's voice was barely audible. "Help me?" Harper approached cautiously, kneeling before the boy. "I'm here to help," he whispered. The boy looked up at him with those empty eyes, and for the first time Harper saw something: recognition, gratitude, or perhaps peace. The figures slowly faded into the mist, leaving Harper alone in the clearing. The next day, the reports of the boy on Ridgeway Road stopped. But Officer Harper would never forget that night, or the chilling realization that some souls are simply waiting for someone to hear their final plea for help. The disappearing caller's Officer Mendoza couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong with the house from the 911 call. After learning about the woman who had died there years ago, she began to wonder if the calls she received were from someone or something trapped in time. But the logical part of her mind refused to accept it. Maybe it was a prank, or maybe there were technical errors with the system. Still, her gut told her otherwise. A few nights later, another call came in, this time even more frantic than the last. 911, what's your emergency? They're back. Please help me. They're inside again, the same voice screamed. Mendoza's blood ran cold. It was the same woman, the same address. Mendoza dispatched officers to the house once more, but something told her she needed to go too. This time, she couldn't just sit at the desk, waiting for an update. She grabbed her coat, got into her car, and drove to the location. When she arrived, the house loomed dark and decrepit at the end of the street. 2 squad cars were parked out front, but the officers were standing by the cars, looking puzzled. "What's going on?" Mendoza asked, stepping out of her vehicle. "There's no one inside. Same as last time. It's like the house hasn't been touched in years," Officer Roberts said, shaking his head. Mendoza, her heart pounding, decided to go inside herself. The officers followed, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they moved through the empty house. The air was thick with dust, the smell of decay clinging to the walls. As Mendoza reached the second floor, she felt the temperature drop dramatically. Her breath came out in visible puffs, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She entered the master bedroom, and that's when she heard it. A faint, almost inaudible whisper. "They're here. Please. Don't let them get me." It was the woman's voice again, but it wasn't coming from the phone this time. It was in the room with her. Mendoza's hands shook as she shined her flashlight around the room. In the corner, something caught her eye. A shadow, darker than the rest of the room. It moved, slipping along the wall like smoke. She blinked, and the shadow was gone. The officers had moved ahead to clear the other rooms, but Mendoza was rooted to the spot. She felt a cold, clammy hand brush against her shoulder, and for a brief moment she saw a figure, a woman, her face contorted in fear, reaching out to her from the corner of the room. And then, just as quickly, the figure vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. The house was empty, but Mendoza knew better. The woman who had called 911 wasn't alive, and yet she was trapped, reliving the night of her death over and over again. And as Mendoza walked out of that house, she couldn't help but wonder how many more calls would come from the dead. Some cries for help, it seemed, would never be answered. The shadow on Ridgeway Road weeks had passed since Officer Harper last encountered the boy and his mother on Ridgeway Road, but the weight of that night lingered like a dark cloud over him. The calls had stopped, but his nightmares hadn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he found himself back in the woods, hearing the faint whispers of "Help me" echo through the trees. One evening, as Harper sat in his patrol car, staring out at the quiet streets of the town, his radio crackled to life again. It wasn't dispatch this time. It was faint, like a whisper carried on the wind, but unmistakable. "Help me?" Harper's heart raced. It was the boy's voice. But the call didn't come from Ridgeway Road this time. It came from inside the town, near an old, forgotten cemetery at the edge of the woods. Harper's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel. He knew he shouldn't go, but something inside him, maybe curiosity, maybe guilt, compelled him to find out what was happening. He arrived at the cemetery just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the gravestones. The air was unnaturally cold for autumn, and the sound of his boots crunching on the fallen leaves was the only thing he could hear. No birds, no crickets, just silence. As he walked deeper into the cemetery, the mist began to thicken around him, swirling in strange patterns. Then he saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the cemetery, near a row of old, crumbling graves. It was the boy, his eyes locked on Harper as he stood motionless among the tombstones. Harper's breath caught in his throat. "What do you want?" he called out, his voice shaking. The boy didn't move, didn't speak. Instead, he raised a hand, pointing toward one of the gravestones behind him. Harper hesitated, but forced himself to move closer, his flashlight flickering as he approached the boy. When Harper reached the gravestone, he saw something that made his stomach turn. The stone was old, its inscription weathered and barely legible, but he could make out the names: Sarah Williams and James Williams. Mother and son. The dates of death were the same, marking the day of the fatal car accident. As Harper knelt to examine the gravestone, he felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature. His breath came out in rapid puffs of mist, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Slowly, he turned around, And there, standing just a few feet away, was the woman. Her face was gaunt, her eyes wide with desperation. She reached out toward Harper, her fingers trembling. "Help him," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Harper felt frozen in place, unable to speak or move. The boy stood beside her, his expression unchanged. It was as if they were waiting for him to do something, but he had no idea what. Before he could react, the figures began to fade into the mist, dissolving into the cold night air, leaving Harper alone in the cemetery. But just as they disappeared, Harper noticed something. The ground beneath the gravestone was disturbed, as if it had been dug up recently. His heart raced as he realized what they wanted him to find. He returned the next day with a team, and sure enough, beneath the grave, they found something that shouldn't have been there. A second body, one that hadn't been buried properly. It was the boy, James Williams. His remains had been carelessly placed in a shallow grave next to his mother's, as if someone had tried to cover up the fact that he hadn't died in the crash, but had been left to perish alone in the woods. The discovery shocked the town, and the case was reopened. It turned out that the original crash hadn't been an accident at all. The mother had been driven off the road by someone she had known, someone who wanted to keep a dark secret buried. With the truth finally uncovered, Harper hoped the spirits of the boy and his mother could finally rest in peace. But even after the case was closed, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something still lingered on Ridgeway Road, watching, waiting. He didn't know if it was guilt, the boy's lingering presence, or something far darker, but every time he passed by that stretch of road, he could swear he still heard the faint whisper of, "Help me." The disappearing caller's Officer Mendoza tried to put the eerie events at the old house behind her, but no matter how hard she tried, the calls from the dead woman seemed to follow her. Every so often late at night, her phone would ring, showing no caller ID, and every time, the same panicked voice would whisper, "They're here, don't let them get me." Each call sent a shiver down her spine. She knew the woman was dead. She had seen the records, heard the history of the house, but something kept pulling her back to that place, like an unfinished chapter in a terrifying book. Determined to get to the bottom of it, Mendoza returned to the house during daylight hours, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. This time, she wasn't alone. She brought a local historian who specialized in the town's older buildings, hoping he might shed some light on the house's dark past. As they walked through the decrepit rooms, the historian shared stories of the house's original owners. It had been built in the early 1900s by a wealthy couple, but tragedy had struck when their young daughter went missing. Rumor had it that she had been playing hide-and-seek and was never found, her body lost somewhere in the house or surrounding property. The family, devastated, eventually left, and the house passed through several owners before the murder of the woman who had lived there most recently. "There's something about this house," the historian said, his voice grave. "It holds onto its tragedies like they're etched into its very walls." Mendoza shivered as they entered the basement. The air was thick and damp, and the light from her flashlight barely penetrated the oppressive darkness. Suddenly, her radio crackled to life again. "They're here," the voice whispered. "Don't let them find me." Mendoza's blood ran cold. It was the same voice, but this time it was different. Closer, more urgent. She looked around, shining her flashlight into every corner, but the basement was empty. The historian's face had gone pale, and he hurriedly suggested they leave. But Mendoza wasn't ready to give up. There was something hidden in this house, something that had been buried and forgotten, and she was determined to find it. As they left the basement and moved upstairs, Mendoza noticed something strange. The wallpaper in one of the upstairs bedrooms had peeled away in a pattern that looked deliberate, almost like a trail. She pulled at the loose edges and gasped as a hidden door was revealed, blending seamlessly into the wall. Behind the door was a small crawl space, barely large enough for an adult to enter. Mendoza shined her flashlight inside and froze. There, in the dust and darkness, was an old doll, its glass eyes staring blankly at her. But it wasn't the doll that terrified her. It was the small, skeletal remains next to it, curled up in a fetal position. It was the body of a child, long forgotten and left to decay in the hidden space. The historian muttered a prayer under his breath as Mendoza radioed for backup. The discovery sent shockwaves through the town. The missing girl had finally been found, more than a century after she had disappeared. But even as the case was closed and the house was boarded up, Mendoza couldn't shake the feeling that something remained. The phone calls had stopped, but late at night as she lay in bed, she could still hear the faint whisper of a voice she'd never forget. "They're here. Don't let them find me." Had she uncovered the truth? Or had she merely scratched the surface of something far darker, something that could never truly be put to rest?